All right, how's it going, everyone? My name is Erich Riesen. I am a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder. Just quickly wanted to thank the AI and Society group for putting on this amazing conference. So my talk is titled Anti-Codifiability, the Failure of an Argument Against Autonomous Weapon Systems. I originally wanted to talk about two arguments, but I just don't have the time. So a bit of background, this is part of a larger project in which I argue that now is not the time to ban autonomous weapon systems. Autonomous weapon systems are artificial intelligence systems that can make and act on decisions concerning the termination of enemy soldiers and installations without direct intervention from a human being. I borrow this definition from the authors whose argument I'm interacting with here. For example, Israel has a weapon system, the Harpy or Harpy. Harpy is fully autonomous, or at least has a fully autonomous setting. It can target and destroy, once deployed, of course, it can target and destroy enemy radar without any intervention from a human being. So it's a long way away from targeting human beings. But we do have fully autonomous weapons, and many countries are kind of working on machine autonomy and militarizing autonomous systems. And so it's something we should be thinking about. So this is part of a larger project in which I say now is not the time to ban these weapons because of the possible massive moral gains that these weapons could bring about. So massive reductions in psychological risk of psychological harm, and moral risk of our own soldiers. And then they also allow for the use of non-lethal weapons, which could seriously reduce the risk of suffering and death for enemy combatants and civilians. So I think we have strong reasons to continue to develop these technologies. So what I'm doing here is responding to a sort of in-principle objection to autonomous weapon systems that come from Duncan Purvis, Ryan Jenkins, and Bradley Strasser. And I think my critique gets at a larger problem. Some ethicists, certainly not all, but some ethicists do not really understand the current state of play in AI research. And they rely on mistaken views about the nature of technology, and they implicitly assume a faulty conception of the relationship between humans and machines. So I think the critique I have on this specific argument sort of gets at these larger issues and how some ethicists are conceptualizing autonomous systems in general and autonomous weapon systems in particular. Okay, so here's the arguments, the anti-codifiability argument. So premise one, moral decision-making requires moral judgment. This is the anti-codifiability thesis. In other words, making moral decisions, you can't codify morality, right? Making good moral decisions requires something over and above a list of rules. The authors then say that machines necessarily cannot replicate human moral judgment. So machines can never be trusted to make sound moral decisions. If we can't trust machines to make sound moral decisions, well, then by golly, we shouldn't use them in war, right? They're not going to be able to reliably adhere to the laws of war when it comes to recognizing surrender, distinguishing combatants from non-combatants, and making proportionality judgments. Judgments about how much civilian death and property damage is acceptable given the kind of military objectives at play. And so why think this? Why think that machines cannot replicate human moral judgment? The authors give an argument along these lines. One, moral judgment cannot be captured by a list of rules, right? It requires something else, right? So maybe reflective equilibrium, qualitative mental states or consciousness or phenomenology, moral intuitions. It requires something over and above kind of a list of moral rules. So we can't capture moral judgment with a list of rules. The authors then say that AI is the product of a list of rules. Therefore, AI is never going to be able to replicate human moral judgment. Now, I think premise two is false. I think, the authors are sort of operating under an old view of artificial intelligence. They're not taking into account neural networks. I mean, they're not taking into account the fact that not all systems run on the basis of explicit instructions provided by humans. But that's not what I want to focus on right now. Instead, I want to get at what I see as a kind of more fundamental problem with the argument. I think the argument embodies a category mistake. In other words, I think it's a category mistake to say that machines are making moral decisions. The hardware, the architecture, the software of these systems, they're not making moral decisions. They're not moral agents, and they need not be moral agents. And I think that this argument sort of, the authors are thinking in terms of like killer robots, that these are these robots that need to make, moral decisions. They have to be moral agents. They're not going to be able to do that. And so we shouldn't use them. They're not going to be safe. So I think they're operating under a tool-based or a hardware-based definition of technology, where a piece of technology is this thing external to us that we manipulate, that's under our control. And the problem is with autonomous technologies, it's this thing external to us that's not under our control. And so that thing had better be a moral agent and be able to operate on the basis of moral reasons and have good moral judgment. Instead, I think we should take a technological systems approach to defining the kind technology. And a technological system is an extended, spatially and temporally extended system, which human beings, the designers, the testers, the operators are seen as parts of the larger system. And I think this works really well for the military that really emphasizes the weapons system, right? It's this large extended system. And so these systems are not moral agents, nor will they ever be moral agents. George Lucas Jr. says similar things. He says that the machines cannot commit war crimes. They can only malfunction or make mistakes. And quote, morality and legality are ultimately a property and the responsibility of the system as a whole, not solely its machine components. And so I think that these are not moral agents, these systems. They're technological extensions of moral agents. And so I think when we clean up the argument with this in mind, we get something like this. Proper moral decision-making requires moral judgment. Hardware, architecture, software, right? The machine, the non-human parts of the system cannot replicate human moral judgment. Therefore, those non-human parts of the system can never be trusted to implement our sound moral decisions, right? But this argument is no longer valid. 1 and 2 might be true. And even if we assume they're true, that doesn't lead us, that doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is true. And I think we actually have kind of a route forward here. We have some reasons for thinking that the conclusion is false. And so I'm thinking here along the lines of inverse reinforcement learning, right? So in inverse reinforcement learning, human beings are not providing the system with an explicit reward. Moreover, the system is not merely just imitating a human being, right? In these systems, the algorithm, the system is able to infer goals, the intentions of the human being. Right. And so we've been able to get artificial systems to be able to do really complicated tasks that not even human beings can do. Right. So in Brian Christian's new book, The Alignment Problem, he talks about this helicopter where no human being can do this crazy trick on the helicopter. But we've been able to get inverse reinforcement learning systems to do this crazy trick, right? Just by having humans provide some feedback to the system. So what's happening here, according to Brian Christian, what's happening is that the system is basically soaking up our intentions, our values, our goals. We don't have to explicitly encode that into the system. We can just sort of nudge it in the right directions and it can soak those up. And so what I think is it's an open and empirical question whether or not machines will one day outpace humans in their ability to recognize surrender, to distinguish combatants from non-combatants, and make reasonable proportionality judgments. I don't think we can decide that sort of a priori with an ethical argument or kind of giving moral reasons to say, nope, they're never going to be able to reliably adhere to the laws of war. I think that's an open question. If inverse reinforcement learning proves to be really, really powerful, well, then maybe in the future, the machines, right, the non-human parts of the system will be able to soak up our intentions, our values, our goals. And if so, then that's great. And there's a bunch of benefits, I think, that would come from that. And so I think, yeah, this argument fails because the authors are operating with sort of the wrong conception of technology. And you hear the term killer robots thrown around a lot. And I think that's just the wrong way to think about this. It sort of disconnects the human designers and testers and operators from the system. We need to think about these systems as much more integrated. And any kind of reasons or moral decisions that the non-human parts of the system is making, the software, the architecture, those are ours, right? It's inheriting those from us. And thus the system extends our moral agency and doesn't need to bring any of its own to the table. All right, thank you very much.